Top 10 Worst Pit Stop Fails Ever. Before Formula One teams turned pit stops into an art form, pit stops were considered important as part of the race itself. While Red Bull still holds the record for the fastest time to change all 4 tyres, other teams have had impressive records as well. But here we'll discuss our top 10 worst pit stop failures in the history of Formula One. Being in such a pressurized environment sometimes makes things go inevitably wrong from time to time. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't and ring the notifications bell to stay connected. Jerome D'Ambrosio, Hungarian Grand Prix 2011. Many fans won't remember D'Ambrosio in 20 years, and those that do will most likely only recall the magnificent pit lane spin he performed during the 2011 Hungarian Grand Prix. Rain fell heavily and D'Ambrosio was called in to change to intermediates. Unfortunately, someone had painted a huge blue strip along the length of the pit lane, and this was even slipperier than the rest of the track. D'Ambrosio put his right front tyre on the blue, lost control and went into a spin. His mechanics got out of the way sharpish, and the car came to a halt, having somehow not hit anything. He got going again and finished the race in 19th. Lewis Hamilton, Malaysian Grand Prix 2013. When you've spent your whole career at one team, moving to another can be a trying experience. Lewis Hamilton was only driving his second race for Mercedes after leaving McLaren when he was called in to change to slicks. He trundled down the pit lane, spotted his mechanics and turned into his box. Only it wasn't his box anymore. Fans around the world burst out laughing as the McLaren mechanics frantically waved at him to get out of the way. He stopped at his new team a few doors down, was quickly serviced, and he finished third. The Frying Fins, Brazilian Grand Prix 2009. The drivers couldn't really see what was going on during a pit stop and all left to rely on either a light system or the traditional lollipop man. In the 2009 Brazilian Grand Prix, Heikki Kovalainen's lollipop man inexplicably thought the stop was over and indicated the fin should leave. Kovalainen obliged, but his mechanics hadn't finished refueling his car. One was sent flying and the fuel hose was ripped from its mounting. It trailed behind the car, spewing fuel everywhere. Kimi Raikkonen had the misfortune of being right behind the McLaren, and the heat of his exhaust ignited the fuel. For a few seconds, his car was engulfed in flames. The Brawn mechanics at the end of the pit lane were kind enough to take the fuel hose off Kovalainen's car, and both men carried on, with Raikkonen finishing 6th. Jackman, San Marino Grand Prix 2000. During free practice for Ferrari's home race at Imola in 2000, Michael Schumacher came in to finish a run. Perhaps trying out a new braking point for the race, he came in a bit too fast. The front jackman admirably remained at his post and didn't let go of the jack even as his face plummeted towards the nose cone of the F1 2000. It must have hurt, but how many of us will find it simple to tell our grandchildren that we once got run over by Michael Schumacher? David Coulthard, Australian Grand Prix 1995. David Coulthard was leading the 1995 Australian Grand Prix and needed a quick stop to retain the lead. He didn't even make it into the pit lane. It's much better to think of this one as a plain and simple driver error because it's so much funnier that way. Sadly, the true cause was a bit less clear. When Coulthard came off the accelerator, he was in too high a gear for the corner. The engine increased the revs to stop itself from stalling, which increased his speed. On the slippery track, he couldn't slow down quickly enough and understeered into the wall. Lewis Hamilton, Canadian Grand Prix 2008. At the 2008 Canadian Grand Prix, Adrian Sutil's car failed and then caught fire. The safety car was deployed and it wiped out Lewis Hamilton's fairly commanding lead. Nearly everyone rushed into the pits, and a sluggish stop by McLaren saw Hamilton drop behind Kimi Raikkonen and Robert Kubica as they headed for the exit. Because the safety car train was still passing by the pit exit, the little-used red light was on at the end of the pit lane. Raikkonen and Kubica stopped as required, but Hamilton and future teammate Nico Rosberg didn't. Hamilton first slid into the back of Raikkonen, taking both out of the race. Then Rosberg came along and lost his front wing on the rear of Hamilton's McLaren. Raikkonen wasn't best pleased, but Kubica took advantage to claim his only F1 win. Felipe Massa, Singapore Grand Prix 2008. Felipe Massa was leading the Singapore Grand Prix when Nelson Piquet Jr. intentionally crashed into a wall, bringing out the safety car. The Ferrari driver pitted, with teammate Kimi Raikkonen queuing up behind. His team were using a light system over the traditional lollipop man. Massa's mechanics were still refueling the car when the lights turned green and the Brazilian drove out, taking the fuel hose with him. He had to stop at the end of the pit lane, and by the time Ferrari personnel ran down to remove the hose, he'd lost a lot of time. A certain points finish and possible win was lost. Massa later came second in the championship, just 1 point behind winner Lewis Hamilton. Mark Webber, German Grand Prix 2013. Often pit lane mistakes are at least a little bit amusing, but this one was downright terrifying. The Red Bull mechanics, usually known for their lightning-fast pit stops, were struggling to secure Mark Webber's right rear wheel. As they were working on it, the signal was given for him to leave. As the Australian set off, the wheel detached and started rolling at speed down the pit lane. It hit a wheel gun on the floor and bounced up, striking cameraman Paul Allen. He suffered a broken collarbone and ribs, but was otherwise all right. Webber, who had looked on course to challenge for the race win, recovered to 7th. Jos Verstappen, German Grand Prix 1994. In 1994, Benetton were a little bit creative with the rules. Refueling had been reintroduced at the start of the season, and Benetton removed a safety filter from their hoses, allowing fuel to flow into the car faster. It was illegal to do this, but checks weren't as rigid in those days. At that year's German Grand Prix, Jos Verstappen stopped on lap 15. The fuel hose didn't go on properly and the highly flammable liquid sprayed all over the place. The heat from the engine cover ignited the fuel. The huge fireball that resulted caused minor burns to Verstappen and several team members. But had fire protective clothing for pit crews not been made mandatory at the start of the season, it could have been a lot worse. It couldn't be confirmed with absolute certainty that the team's filter fiddling had caused the fire, but it can't have helped either.